prayers.
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. O Lord our God, who art the lover of justice and truth, give thy grace to our Parliament and to all who direct the affairs of our nation, and guide them by thy Holy Spirit, we beseech thee, that by thy word and deed they may promote the well-being of this people and set forward peace among all men through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcement by Your Honour.
Minutes of our meeting from May 29th, 2024 for confirmation. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the confirmation of the aforementioned minutes dated Wednesday, May 29th, 2024 for confirmation again.
Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Those minutes are accordingly confirmed. Minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, July 17th, 2024 for deferral.
Mr. President, I beg to move the deferral of the minutes of Wednesday, July 17th, 2024.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, July 7th, 2024 be deferred. With all honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Those minutes are accordingly deferred. I want to acknowledge some visitors to our chamber. Tamara Moss, an attorney at law from the Bahamas, and guests from, I'm not sure where, renewable energy guests. Renario Barriaga, Mauro Sobers, and Julio Mateo. Welcome.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following documents: the annual report and audited financial statements of the Barbados Port Inc. for the year ended March 31st, 2023, as well as the audited statement of accounts for the Board of Management of the Lodge School for the year ended March 31st, 2022.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions related to the business or sitting of the Senate moved by minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 and 22-1 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Orders 22-1 and 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. No. Meeting the ayes have it. Those standing orders are accordingly suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice and to move the first readings of the Bail Bill 2024 and the Criminal Justice Plea Agreements and Negotiations Bill 2024.
The question is that the Bail Bill 2024 and the Criminal Justice Plea Agreements and Negotiations Bill 2024 be read the first time. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The next the ayes have it.
That is automatic.
Those bills are accordingly read first time.
On this bill?
Yes.
Mr. President, I advise that we're taking order number 6 on the supplementary order paper, which stands in the name of the leader, honorary leader of the Senate, and will be introduced by Senator, the Honourable C.J. Blackman. And the item of business is to move the second reading of the Bail Bill 2024.
Senator Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise with respect to the bill before us this morning. And I want to start by saying, Mr. President, that in order for society to be governed, and in order for that said society to be governed well, particularly with respect to law and order and good governance, governments around the world, governments across the Commonwealth, governments across the Caribbean, and certainly this government and this chamber is no different. And therefore, in such a pursuit, we are therefore here this morning to debate the bill before us. And I want to start at the onset in making it lucidly clear that this administration is settled on one thing: that there can be no room for crime, there can be no room for serious crime, and therefore Barbados as a country must also be on board in that pursuit of a zero tolerance to criminal matters in this country. And therefore the issue and the bill before us is not just one that is of significant import to the government. Certainly, Mr. President, I and my colleagues on this side are of the strong persuasion that it is also a matter of significant importance to the opposition, to independent senators, because why? It goes to the heart of stable governance in our society. And therefore, I see this debate within that context, given the importance of the bill, and given the importance of ensuring that as we move the society forward, that we can govern and govern well, and ensuring, as I said, issues of good governance for the pursuit of ensuring that our society can continue to function and function well in the interests of all. And it is therefore even more important to send a very clear message, not just to those here, but around the world, that Barbados, in its pursuit of zero tolerance of crime and serious criminal matters, that the entire ecosystem of our governance structure is behind the mantra of that zero tolerance in crime in Barbados. And I start on that basis so that I frame today's debate within the context of this not just being a bill brought by the government side, but it is a bill brought by the government side in pursuit of its mandate to the people of Barbados, people born and people unborn, that we must ensure that the law protects the interests of our people. And should you run afoul of the law, not only are there consequences to those actions that can impede the good governance and stability of our country, but that you understand that the weight of the law will also be upon you. I want to recall, Mr. President, that since coming to office in 2018, this administration has taken significant and serious measures relative to crime and criminal matters in Barbados. It is a priority. It was then when we first came into office in 2018, and it remains one now, 6 years after, in pursuit of that governance and stability that I treat to. And I want to also recall, Mr. President, that in 2018, the administration would have convened a national security briefing where different interest groups and stakeholders were convened, and it included, of course, the then opposition leader, senators, senior public servants, former commissioners of police. And you may ask yourself, why would an administration do that so early in its term and at the onset of their term? As I said, this administration understands that if Barbados is to continue to be a stable society, a society which protects its citizens and those who live here and visit us, those who do business here, our mothers, our grandmothers, our children, that stability must be underscored by ensuring that criminal matters receive significant attention, the necessary resources to creating that ecosystem, and also ensuring that those who may want to run afoul of the law understand that the ecosystem will not facilitate such a negative interest. And therefore, when you look at where we were in the court system, Mr. President, you may recall that at the time there were only 2 judges on rotation. Now, when you look at that fact, and it's not something that any country could be proud of at the time or generally, but the fact remains is that if you have only 2 judges on rotation in your courts treating to criminal matters, it therefore means there invariably will be a backlog of cases. And that was the case. There was a high degree of backlogs with respect to the criminal cases moving through our courts. But equally to the task, and resolved in its mind, the administration made clear that it was going to, at the onset, treat to that shortfall. And therefore, in resolving that matter, it led, of course, even before I get to the resolving, that backlog led to judges having to, in those circumstances, oftentimes grant bail so that persons were not subject to lengthy stays on remand. It's a fact. This is the situation we found in 2018. An unfortunate one, but one which confronted the administration, and of course, being elected to govern, what must you do, Mr. President? You must govern. And the administration took a decision that that was not fit for purpose for a modern criminal justice system in this country. And therefore, the government appointed an additional 3 judges at that time. And last 2 years, in 2022, an additional 3. And therefore, you see now a situation where you don't only have the 2, but you have more judges, and the cases can now move quicker through the system. Why? In the pursuit of justice and also ensuring that the criminal justice system and that wider ecosystem, as I spoke about, can function and is fit for purpose in a modern Barbados. Now, equally, and to the system's credit, notwithstanding the difficult time that COVID presented, the court system was able to move the cases through. And we now had a situation where in 18 months, Mr. President, 584 indictable matters were settled. 584. We also saw 61 of those cases were for murder. And of course, the government increased the number of prosecutors and the support staff. Because why? If you're going to bring cases to court, you also have to ensure, as I said, in that ecosystem, the tiers and the limbs that help it to function are functioning well and have the capacity to be able to meet that increased demand in its use, so as to ensure that the system is moving well. We'd also recall, Mr. President and my dear colleagues, that last year, the Office of Attorney General held a 2-day symposium focusing on the criminal justice reform. And why is this important? Because if we are to, as I said at the onset, look beyond the now, being cognizant, of course, of where we've come from, the realities currently on the ground now, but where do we go to ensure that our criminal justice system is fit for purpose? You constantly, like many other things, have to take a pause and to review. And therefore, they held that 2-day symposium with members of the legal fraternity and members of the judiciary, and of course, members of our police service. But they've gone further. We've gone further as an administration. We've seen in this chamber legislation such as the Criminal Procedure Amendment 2024, judge alone trials, and also legislation with respect to plea bargaining to help ease the backlog. Now, if you look across CARICOM, both our sister nation of Jamaica and in addition Belize have seen the benefit of the plea bargaining system to their jurisdictions. And Barbados is no different. Because as I said, part of the modern governance structure of a society, certainly within the Commonwealth, has to be the constant review and retooling of said justice system and ensuring that 1, it's fit for purpose, but 2, you have the capacity to treat to the changing tide on the ground with respect to crime and serious criminal matters that come before the courts. And when we look at also the staff complement that was also given to the Director of Public Prosecutions, that was also increased. And why am I going through this and taking us back from where we started as a government? Is to not only frame the debate within the context of a broader retooling of our system, but to help our honourable members in this chamber on all sides and the wider public to have an appreciation as to where we started, where we're going, how we intend to get there, and equally, what mischief are we trying to treat to. Because it's important that the public understands where we're at and where are we going to go, and why these measures, in our view, are necessary for the times to ensure that stability and good governance that we were all sent to do by the public and in their interests. And as I said, Mr. President, this administration is incredibly serious about the issue of fighting crime. I want to repeat, this administration is very serious on the issue of fighting crime and serious criminal matters in Barbados. And therefore, as we debate today, as we go forward, see it in its broadest context. Because why? It is not a knee-jerk reaction to anything. Part of the governance requires us, Mr. President, that as circumstances change, so too must your posture in ensuring that stability remains. It's just like running a company, running a household. If you're out on a course or on a ship or aircraft, but you see that all of a sudden there are turbulent winds, there's significant turbulence in the aircraft. Notwithstanding that the pilot and the co-pilot may have the aircraft on a certain trajectory, it requires them to pause and take stock and assess the situation and to move forward so that you can land the plane safety in the interests of everyone. And this bill, therefore, within the context of where we are as a country, is no different, as I said. We also saw a situation where our police had their budget increase. And why is that also important? Because if the police, who are, and let me take this moment to publicly once again praise them for the human service that they're delivering to all of us as a country, they are on the front line of ensuring that we are safe. They are on the front line of ensuring that they have the tools and ability and capacity to respond to moments where there's unrest or there's crime or there's a murder. And therefore, the government saw it necessary to ensure that our police service have the necessary tools and the requisite training to ensure that they also come in to even more modern times of policing. Because the truth is, you may have gone to training school, as all of them do, and you may learn one thing. But as crime and the modalities of crime change, you have to constantly retool. Similarly, lawyers do the same thing in their profession, doctors do the same thing in their profession, accountants do the same thing in their profession, and therefore the government saw the wisdom and the necessity to ensure that the resources and the requisite resources are at the disposal of our police. And I want to again thank our police service for the yeoman service that they deliver. Now, with respect to ensuring that the entire apparatus of the criminal justice system is functioning well and responding to the needs of our country, not only then is it about equipping our police, not only is it about equipping the Director of Public Prosecution and their office, it is also about ensuring, as I said, should there be a crime, should there be a serious crime, what apparatus does the law have to ensuring that, one, there's a high level of deterrence in the system, but two, we're not having a revolving door where persons can pass through that said justice system and commit crimes whilst they're accused or before the courts, out on bail, and reoffend again. That is at the heart of today's debate. That is at the heart of the very debate. And you'll recall, Mr. President, that in 2019, some 4 years ago, the government sought to make amendments and made the amendments in the Bail Act. And when you look at in particular, Section 5A of that Act, the issue was that it required the court to deny bail to persons charged with murder or for firearm offenses for at least 24 months. Okay? It came through Parliament, it passed, and that was the law. This section, however, was tested in the High Court and was found to be unconstitutional. And therefore, it went to the appeal court, where there's still a pending decision. But given the circumstances, as I said, like any good pilot, like any good head of a household, like any good head of a company, it requires us from time to time, notwithstanding the trajectory of direction of where we want to go and where we need to go, that you have to evaluate and re-evaluate given where you are. And where we are today, Mr. President, is no different. And I'm sure our colleagues, as they not only debate, but as they sit quietly in contemplation as to where we are with respect to fighting crime and serious crime in our country, would appreciate that the government, therefore, within the context of that re-evaluation, but also ensuring good governance is there, would appreciate that this is necessary within the circumstances. So therefore, of course, the country awaits the decision of the Court of Appeal. But equally, the government, given the circumstances we have before us today, has taken the view that we cannot wait on the decision given the circumstances. So of course, the court will continue its process independent from the government. But the government is here today because why? It requires us to protect our people and to protect the very system of criminal justice itself in the interest of all. And therefore, when you listen to the public outcries, Mr. President, and I'm sure all colleagues on all sides would agree, there is a strong view in Barbados, a country 21 by 14 miles wide, a population of just under 300,000, not large by any stretch of any imagination, by any indicator, where generally we all know each other, plus or minus, that crime, and let's get real and let's get specific now, murder, attempted murder, gun crimes, cannot be tolerated in Barbados. It's simply too small for it to happen. And why am I saying this? The government spends significant money on education. And this is not just this administration, I'm talking government in its totality of Barbados, where we try to create an environment where people can have opportunities, where people can go to school and learn. We create a climate where people can come and invest. We create a climate where people can come host international tournaments. We create a climate here where communities can have their fish fry on a Saturday. But all of that can be eroded by one gunshot. All of that can be eroded by one person not involved in any criminal activity, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they would have left home in circumstances to go about their ordinary business, and unfortunately may not return home because of a single act of a serious crime. And therefore, as I said, with respect to that good governance, we have to ensure that our people are protected. Equally, there are persons who find themselves in criminal activities now. So you're not talking about you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. You are part and parcel of criminal activity. And because of one issue or the other, one disagreement or the other, there are reprisals. And this body and their emotions were wounded, or you have something that belongs to me, and a whole host of other issues. And you're having murders, you're having attempted murders, you're having people being found with firearms. The last time I checked, Mr. President, and I'm sure my colleagues today can confirm and agree with me, Barbados is the oldest producer of rum. We manufacture rum, we produce rum, we produce world-class cricketers. We have an abundance of culture. We produce crop over. We produce some of the best seasonings in the world, Mr. President. We produce things that tourists come and enjoy. But one thing I don't see on our production and manufacturing sheets, and one thing I don't see on our export sheets, is the production of weapons. And therefore, it begs the question, one, not only where do they come from, but given that we don't produce these things, it therefore means that there's a problem that we all know, but we have to address it. And I also want to frame this in a broader context. There is that temptation, and I heard the Honourable Senator Morris in a recent program refer to the fact, and he's right, that this is not just a phenomenon being experienced by Barbados alone. Sadly, across our region today, country after country after country continues to grapple with the issue of gun crime, because the ease of which countries can have access, illegally of course, to guns coming out of the north into our waters is a major problem. There are a lot of capacity issues, of course, but we have to collectively treat to these things. So I place that point there for context, so that as we realize and as we look ahead in this debate and beyond, it is not just about the bail bill. The bail bill is taking place in a broader context of which we must address regionally, which clearly we are addressing nationally, but we have an obligation to make sure that we protect all within our jurisdiction. And therefore, the public concern is real, it is justified, and it is a view also held by the government. You've heard Prime Minister Motley speak to it time and time again, the Attorney General speak to it time and time again, you've heard the Commissioner of Police speak to it time and time again. No one in Barbados who has the interests of Barbados at heart wants to see crime and serious crime taking place in our country. And therefore, we echo that not only by words, but by virtue of the bill here today. But equally, what is of concern is the simple fact that you have a person or persons, Mr. President, being brought before the courts for a criminal matter, and in this context, murder, or being found with a firearm or firearms in their possession. They go through the court system, but they get bailed. They're out on the streets again. And you would believe that if you are given a chance to maintain your freedom pending trial, that you would, the logical person, in my view, would honestly use that as a time for reflection, for pause, and awaiting trial and the outcome. But we found time and 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 time again, the number of persons who are brought before the courts receiving bail are now recommitting offenses whilst out on bail. When we talk about, as I said, the good governance of society, ensuring that there's stability and peace amongst our society, this is what we're talking about. And the public outcry on this matter is a very real one, and it is one in which we too, as a government, share that view and share that sentiment. And therefore, what is the state of play as we currently stand? At the end of January, in the system, there were 106 murder cases. 8 were manslaughter cases, and 254. Let me repeat it. There were 254 firearm charges pending. That is no small number. In other words, that is 254 separate charges for firearms in a country that does not produce firearms, in a country that can't ill afford crime and murders and people getting shot when they go about their ordinary business. And you can look on TV or you go to the funerals where mothers and fathers and families have to hold their belly because why? A loved one was taken away from them. What good society is going to stand by and watch that taking place in circumstances where a lot of the perpetrators are already out on bail and coming back into the system, or society rather, and reoffending? Because why? A lot of them have the view, you know what, I get bail, I can do what I gotta do to you, I get bail again, I can do what I gotta do to you, I get bail again, etc. There can be no place for that, Mr. President, not in Barbados. And the government is sending a very clear message to all and sundry. If you want to commit crime in this country, understand that the law will not allow you to do so. There must be consequences to your actions. In physics, there's a maxim. To every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so too is this matter. But equally, the number of matters waiting for indictments, not 254 as in the circumstance of the firearm charges, Mr. President. There are some 1,600. They're not. And it therefore justifies what the administration would have done to ensure that we have the adequate number of judges to help us walk through the cases throughout our systems. The number of criminal counsel in here today who I'm sure when they rise will treat a number of these issues. But this is the state of play where we are. But let's bring it closer home, Mr. President. This year alone, 2024, to date, and I pray this number that I will call will not be surpassed, there have been 26 murders, 26 in Barbados. That small country that I described, 300,000 people or plus or minus. 26 murders. And 17 of those 26, Mr. President, were related to firearm activity. 6 were stabbings and 2 relative to bludgeoning. Why do I make this point? Because we're not just talking about murder, as I said, serious crimes and firearms, but we're talking about murder and firearms. Therefore, you're starting to see, therefore, a correlation with respect to the high number. And if the criminal element of our society believe that they can do as they like, walk through the court system and come out on bail, do as they like and repeat, who then has the responsibility to stop it? It is not just the government of the day. Of course, the government brings the bill, but it is the ecosystem of governance that has to treat to this issue. Because why? Issue of fighting crime is not a Barbados Labour Party issue. It is not a Democratic Labour Party issue. It is not an independent issue. It is an issue for whomever is in the governance ecosystem of this fair land called Barbados. And therefore, we have taken the decision that now is the time to ensure that our Bail Act is fit for purpose in protecting those mothers, in protecting those young people. And the truth is also you still have to protect the life of those who unfortunately find themselves in devious activity. Because as a state and as a country, we are there and the laws are there to protect all, notwithstanding the company that you may keep. And therefore, this is a message to all of our people, not just young people, because older people commit crime in this country too. There is no room for crime in Barbados. None. And if you want to commit serious crime, think again. Now, I want to get into some of the meat of the matter of the bill, Mr. President. When we look at clause 6.10, where we see that the defendant, for example, is charged with an offence as outlined in Schedule 1. It treats to what the court shall do in those circumstances. Clause 6.10 with respect to Schedule 1. And I want to start there because it sets out therefore now where we're now moving to and where we're coming from. And it invariably states that with respect to the defendant, it orders that the court shall, and as everyone who did law, or know about law, or appreciate law, or curious about law, shall imposes what? It's mandatory. There's no discretion. The court shall. Orders that the defendant be detained in custody until the defendant be dealt with in accordance with the law. In other words, once it is outlined in Schedule 1, as I mentioned, you are held in custody until the case is called, or as they call it, the trial is called. And now there are persons who may think, okay, you have to balance the right of the victims, of course, you have to balance the right of the defendant, particularly with respect to his or her liberty. And therefore, you'll also therefore see, added to that, is unless. And why is that unless so important? And for those listening or watching the debate, this is why. In other words, notwithstanding that you will be placed into custody, the court shall place you into custody until your trial is called, unless, so you still have circumstances that you may be out on bail, but the threshold and the test is no higher. Is that the defendant, having been given reasonable opportunity to do so, adduces evidence which satisfies the court that exceptional circumstances exist which, in the interest of justice, permits the defendant's release. So let's make it clear. You're going to shoot somebody, the police hold you, the prosecution finds enough evidence, you're charged, etc. You will be detained until your case is called. Unless the court deems that in the interest of justice, you should not be. So it now places it on a higher plane. Now, Mr. President, notwithstanding, of course, that each country has its own jurisprudence and way of dealing with different things, this bill also finds its similarity and the core of it also from our fellow Commonwealth sister nation of South Africa. And it's important to note that whilst it is not binding on the courts of Barbados, it presents a very good moral suasion and guidance as to where we should go in this direction. And when you look at Section 61A of the Criminal Procedure Act in South Africa, it outlines for us that what I call in the interest of justice test. In other words, as I said, you commit a crime with respect to murder or firearm charge, you're going to be detained until the trial is called. Unless, in the interest of justice, it is not fit to do so. And as such, the overriding criteria of the interest of justice to do so is very, very, very clear. Now, when you look at our bill, and in particular clauses 2, you realize that the arguments, Mr. President, that hitherto have been used, and again, I'm sure members of the chamber who practice at the criminal bar are familiar with what I'm about to speak about. No longer can counsel plead, Your Honor, my client has no previous convictions. My client is not previously known to the court. My client is no flight risk. My client is a good and outstanding citizen of the community. All the different reasons that were used as to why bail should be granted, the burden is now placed on you will be detained until the trial has been called, unless it is in the interest of justice for you to be released. So there is now a higher threshold. And of course that discretion, framed with the unless, is within the court. Because remember, the issue at hand before, when the act was passed in 2019, was that the law had compelled the court. Here, there is a discretion, but that discretion is with respect to ensuring in the interest of justice. Now, why is this important? It is also to send a message to those who want to commit crime, that if you commit crime, if you commit murder, if you have firearms within your possession, or you use your firearm, think twice again, because you're going to go and spend some time waiting on your trial and your liberty, notwithstanding, of course, that we have to balance it. Once you commit your crime, you have to be aware of these provisions as so envisioned. And under 6.2, we also see that the interpretation that the court will use, and also refusing of the bill with respect to one or more grounds, are as follows. And a whole list of them, Mr. President. I'll just go through a few of them. The likelihood that the defendant, if granted bail, will endanger the public's safety. I've given examples of that this morning. You've committed a crime, you've come back out again, you've committed a crime again. The second one, the likelihood that the defendant, if bail is granted, will attempt to evade trial. There are people who believe that I ain't belong in no court system, no dock. And I remember when I was at law school in the UK, we had to do role play. And I once sat in the dock, Mr. President, in role play. And let me say this again for the public, because you know social media is very funny. I sat in the dock in role play. And sitting in the dock in role play is not a comfortable feeling. And I had to remind myself that at the end of this act, that I get enough and getting trained and going home. Because for that moment, it felt so real, I could not believe, or I could not fathom how it felt to be sitting in a dock accused. It is not a good feeling. And therefore, the point I'm making with that, to stay out of that realm, the best thing to do is to stay away from crime. But I go on. Where the likelihood of that defendant, if granted bail, will attempt to influence or intimidate witnesses or conceal or destroy evidence. Mr. President, we've all heard stories after time, where persons accused, persons who are out on bail, will tell you, if it was you, I would not go to court. If I was you, I would not go and give evidence. Because if you do, so-and-so can happen to your family. So-and-so can happen to you. That level of intimidation cannot be. Because why the criminal justice system must ensure that there's protection for witnesses, and ensuring also that people must face justice. And I go on. Where the likelihood that the defendant, if granted bail, will undermine or jeopardize the objectives of the proper functioning of the criminal justice system itself. In other words, You don't want a situation where releasing the person will cause the entire system, which we all rely on and look upon, to come into disrepute or even to be questioned. Because the law has to be sacrosanct, and we have to ensure that the law can be protected in the interests of all and in the interests of justice. And of course, where in exceptional circumstances, the likelihood that the release of the defendant will not be in the interests of the order, of public safety, or public security. Now, I want to focus on this last part here, which is invariably 2E on the clause. Now, in considering, and this is where it gets very interesting, and this is where the meat of the matter comes. Considering the grounds as established under that provision, the court may take into account, Mr. President, the following. Whether the nature of the offense or the circumstances where the offense was committed is likely to induce a sense of shock and outrage in the community. What do I mean by that? And what does the clause and the provision mean and contemplate by that? We only have to look, and unfortunately, at different crimes that we've seen within the last 10 years, 15 years as a nation. We may all recall the shock and the horror that we as a country endured with the gruesome death of those young ladies in the campus trends incident and crime. Those types of, and of course, all criminal matters, all murders are serious and none more than the other. But as humans also, and as a community, there are certain crimes and certain murders, Mr. President, that have evoked a certain national deep outcry of zero tolerance to these sorts of things. And that is one example. Another example, you may cast your mind back to one good morning, there was, I think, an interview taking place on national television. And whilst that interview was being taking place on national television, literally, a gunman executed, that's what you have to call it, in plain sight, a victim, whilst the interview was taking place on national television. Those moments which caused shock at a time when the mall was at its highest doing business, just outside of the food court, I'm sure many of you remember. These are moments that this aspect, for example, is contemplating. Moments that cause the country to think, hold on, what is happening here? But I go on. Whether the defendant, in terms of being released, might jeopardize the safety of the defendant. In other words, you've committed a crime, you're released on bail. But in your release on bail, you stand potentially to be harmed or to be murdered. Because why? Reprisals happen. Where a fella believes, okay, you take out my body, I can take out you. And in the interest of that defendant's safety and life, you have to ensure that they don't go back out on the street. So there are a myriad of examples in the contemplation here. But I go on again, because each of these present clear but well important areas for contemplation in the bill. And whether the sense of peace and security among members of the public will be undermined. In other words, people need to go about their ordinary business knowing that there's a sense of calm. I don't have to look over my shoulder. I can do my things without wondering, am I going to be a target today? Whether intentionally or unintentionally. It comes back to that good governance that we speak about. And of course, whether the release will undermine or jeopardize the public confidence in the criminal justice system, as I mentioned. And lastly, any other factor which, in the opinion of the court, should be taken into account. Mr. President, when we look at where we are today, Barbados is a country based on good governance. It is a country based on the rule of law. It is a country based on ensuring that rights of all, subject to any provisions that would impede that, are granted. And therefore, this is one part of our history in that regard. And when you also then look at the bail proceedings, and when you focus on Clause 6, and in particular Clause 613. Now, under the bill, you have a situation where the defendant or the defense's counsel shall inform the court of any previously had offenses that they've had, or any pending charges, or the release on bail prior to these charges. In other words, you have to now declare to the court, you, meaning one, or your counsel, you let the court know if you have any previous convictions, if there are any pending charges, or if you are out on bail already. And therefore, it now places that burden on the defendant to ensure that you disclose this. But it also goes further, that should you at a later time be found to have lied on this, there's a consequence as well. And I think it's 2 years in imprisonment or $5,000 with respect to that. And the point I'm making here is the law is now contemplating tightening up as well, that the system, as I said, in the interest of ensuring that the ecosystem of the criminal justice system is tightened for all. And when you look at the reasons for bail, and I think this is quite new, and my colleagues in the chamber who are at the criminal bar can treat to this, the bill is now saying also, not only will the judge, must the judge, if they grant you bail, they impose bail, or they deny you bail, reasoning must now be given as to the decision. Reasoning must now be given as to the decision why. And therefore, it also ensures that in the fairness of the defendant, that the defendant and his legal team also has in writing clear, well-articulated reasons for the granting, or the denying, or the amending, as it were, or imposition of that bail. As I said, why is it important? Because it lends to the creation of ensuring that the defendant, in particular, has a clear outline as to the reason why the bail was granted or denied. Now, Mr. President, I've outlined where we've come from. I've outlined the circumstances in which we are today. I've outlined the commitment that this administration has had from the onset of taking office in 2018. I've outlined the circumstances which have changed in terms of crime happening on the ground. I've outlined the government's response with respect to resources allocation to our police, to the DPP. I've outlined the government's response with respect to legislation in our parliament. And equally, I've outlined also government's previous passing of the amendment relative to the Bail Act. And the truth of the matter is that in that pursuit, in that ultimate pursuit of ensuring that there's stability and good governance in our country, in that ultimate pursuit of ensuring that there's a zero tolerance to not just crime, but serious crime and murder and firearm offenses, the government has brought this bill here today, so as to ensure that we can continue with our life in an orderly fashion, and also to send a very strong message to those who believe that they can commit crime and go through the revolving door of the current bail system, as if you're walking into a hotel lobby and being met with the bellhop and he walking you back out. No engaging polance, Mr. President, them days done. And therefore this bill and its contemplation is to bring some tidiness and a tighter mode with respect to bail and how bail is granted. And with those words, Mr. President, I want to encourage our colleagues not just to debate today or the bill as we usually do, but debate it within the consideration and contemplation that this is a national priority for us, for all of us, irrespective of government, opposition, or independent. Because why? We have to ensure the long-term stability of our nation. We have to ensure the long-term stability of our criminal justice system. We have to ensure the long-term good governance of our country that has made Barbados known around the world for being stable, for being peaceful, and for being prosperous. And with those words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you, and I beg that this bill be now read a second time.
Senator Walters.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning to fellow senators. This debate this morning around the bail bill is a very, I would use a very sensitive conversation because crime is something that affects both sides of the spectrum, victims and the society as a whole. And sir, I would want to agree with the principle that there are too many murders in the country, there are too many gun-related crime, there are too many persons caught with firearms in their possession, illegal possession of firearms. I am not, my role here today, sir, is not to pretend to dissect the sections of this law, but to speak broadly about the issues relating to the Bail Act, the committing of crime, and how we treated that, and some of the things that can be done as it relates to expediting those matters. There's no secret that the opposition has been asking for an update to this act, and the government has responded by presenting us here with some things to consider and to discuss today. And I don't see this discussion here today, this forum here, as much as a debate as it is a discussion on how we can strengthen this legislation or how we can put other things in place. Because, as it was said in the other place and it's said in here today, this transcends government. This is about our social security and our welfare as citizens. So, sir, if I do come into the fire line of the government, I ask you to please bail me out.
I'm always here happy to defend all honourable senators. So I will assist as needed.
Because there are many. But I think that this is important, sir, to also put in context, like most persons here would do today, the realities of living in Barbados and crime in Barbados. And while I was blessed to have not been involved in any crime, associated with any crime, never had to go before the court, the judge, the police station in any form, I have still lived through I've felt the effects of crime in my community. And there was a time as a boy when going to the supermarket, you had to be careful. Sometimes in different times of the year, depending on what's happening in different areas of communities around. You couldn't even go to the beach. Because when there is war between communities, sometimes there's no differentiation of who is to be a consequence of the war. Sometimes the persons from the other areas that have to come up to the supermarket, they've got to shop elsewhere. Sometimes communities and constituencies have divides that even as candidates and prospective candidates, we have to manage. It is a reality. Crime is there. Elements of crime are in our society. And as families, as citizens, we all have to maneuver through these realities. Even getting a job, sir. I remember I used my address very carefully so that I would not be disadvantaged in even getting a seat in front of the interviewer. So I said all that to put in context that this has been going on for so long. It has gotten worse because it has gone from getting 2 chops to getting 2 shots, from being hospitalized to being buried. It has gone from guys walking about with a knife or a sword or a stick in the pocket to a gun or an AK in the backseat of a car. So it is very different. So this is to be taken very seriously, but I also want the government to be open to the discussion of the things that we have to do as a parliament, as relating to the whole situation, the bigger picture. So we need to wrestle this situation to the ground. And that is, we need to keep those who are alleged of committing these crimes and those who have committed these crimes off the street. Because, as Senator Blackman said, there are persons who recommit. You do a crime, or you are alleged of doing a crime, you go to the court, you get bail, maybe not immediately, but you get bail, you're back out. You cannot find employment. You cannot find employment, so you have no source of income. So what do? You go back and fall back into exactly the same situation or circumstances in which might have led you to commit that crime in the first place. So we need to keep these persons off of the street. But what is coming out in Senator Blackman's presentation is that we need to make sure that these cases are heard. It really doesn't matter all of the details in the legislation per se, because we hear it is unconstitutional to keep them for more than 24 months or 48 months. So if we do, the government or the court has to grant bail in those instances. But you're putting the persons back into the same situations, to do the same crime, to recommit, to not having a police certificate of character, to not having a job, to not having even a proper family structure that they can support, that can support them. Some of them have children, so they're in the same spiral all the time. We need to ensure as a parliament, as legislators, that those persons, the cases are called. And if those persons, and it is up then to the judge and the jury, etc., to make a decision. But we cannot believe that we have to let these persons out there into the society, and we have to live in fear of the unknown. So coming out of the conversation is that the act or the bill gives the court the ability to give bail, grant bail or not to grant bail. Coming out of the presentation also is that the government has made some headway as it relates to additional judges, additional courts, and that should be commended. What is not clear to me, as I'm not in the system, I'm not a lawyer, a criminal lawyer, etc., is the rate in which these cases are going. We hear the numbers, we also hear the backlog as well. 106 murder cases still outstanding. I think 254 firearm cases. And then we're adding to those daily, weekly, monthly, based on what's happening in the society. So it is not a criticism when we ask, are those courts working expeditiously? Are there additional delays? Are they seeing as much cases as the government had expected? And are we dipping into the backlog so that new cases can be heard more promptly? It's not a criticism to ask that. And when you look at the human resources that not only support the court structure itself, but things that feed in, we have to make sure that they themselves also are adequately human resourced. That's all we're saying. That's all we're saying. You look at the welfare department, the probation department, persons that have to write reports. You look at the child care board in some instances. You look at the police service, persons that have, police has to come and give witness, etc. They have to be available. So you look at the overall resources and the resource pool, and yes, we hear the funding as the increase in the budget for the police service. But we also need to make sure that we are also increasing in the other critical areas that feed into the entire legal system. So it's not a criticism, it's not an argument. It is that we need to make sure that if we have more judges, if we have more courts, that we are getting the results that we anticipate, and if not, we have to fix it. But when we do the expansion, and the more judges and the more courts, etc., we also have to put these things in place proactively and not reactively as well. So the whole notion of a person getting bail for a murder, and we're talking about serious crime, because this is why this bill is being read in all three stages today, because it is important. It is serious. We're talking about murder. We're talking about firearms. So I'm saying to you, if this bill is that important, that means it must be equally important to make sure that these persons are not on the streets. So we need to feed in all of these support systems. Put our money, we put $50 million in Kensington, put $50 million in the judiciary system, and all of the feeding systems, the government's support areas that will make this efficient. Sir, Mr. President, there are also other things that can be considered as it relates to bringing some of these cases to hearings as fast as possible. Because remember, the intent here, from where I sit and where the opposition sit largely, is that we do not want persons that are charged with committing murder, persons that are charged with having illegal firearms, ammunition. We do not want those persons on the streets after being charged, being a nuisance. So the opposition also suggested a few weeks ago the introduction of specialized courts, a gun court. And I call for that support again in that conversation, that dialogue. And we're asking for dialogue in this area to bring a specialized court that would deal with these gun cases, these firearm cases, because as Senator Blackman said, there are 254. And I've been driving, I've seen the police pulling over vehicles, searching, so they are collecting firearms are illegal. So those cases will continue to mount. So what is wrong with considering a gun court? It cannot be because the opposition has suggested it. Why can't you make one or two of the existing courts, specialized courts, that deal with these illegal firearms, this ammunition, and so on, and expedite those cases? So, again, it is about how do we deal with the hearings as fast as possible, so we're not in a position where even if bail is granted to an individual who is charged with committing a crime, a certain time elapses, and then we have the courts have no other way to maintain the person in confinement, and they have to then put them on bail until their hearing is called. So an introduction of a gun court will clearly solve some of this backlog. Some of those 254 cases and some of those cases that are coming in as the police service and the defense force do their work on a daily basis. The opposition, sir, also introduced into the conversation the possibility of having a national discourse on degrees of homicides to feed into the Bail Act. Because if you have the degrees of homicides, first degree, second degree, whatever, manslaughter, then the police then is able to charge based on the evidence, a degree, based on the degree. And then, of course, the bail, you will get bail for some, you will have an option of having bail for some of those, and some of them will not carry the option for bail. And those that do not carry an option for bail, you make sure that those cases are expedited through the court system. Mr. President, we have to reiterate that to wrestle this to the ground, persons that are committing these crimes are into this world of crime, cannot feel that they can just commit crime and come out on the street and have a beer the next 2 weeks and wait for 4 years until the hearing is called, then to get discounted sentences and all these other things. Witnesses don't turn up anymore. Nobody don't want to testify. These are reality. So if we treat the system in that way, this is the response we're going to get as legislators, as a government, any government. But Mr. President, another interesting phenomenon here that has been discussed from the office of the opposition is that when you look at those who are the alleged perpetrators, they are 18 years old of age, 19, 22. They are young men who have no resources to be able to acquire a firearm, who sometimes do not even have a motive to commit a crime. So you are seeing an organization or an organized manner in which crime is conducted, where a person can sit and call the shots, no pun intended, can sit in the back and call the shots and allow these young men, influence these young men to pick up a firearm that they are lent, have no motive against a subject, and go and commit a murder. So how do we reach those persons if there is sufficient evidence to support that? So when the opposition leader asked or called for a conversation around anti-gun legislation, it is a serious conversation that the country needs to have. And it has to be put in the context of those, as I said, that are sitting behind the scenes and controlling what is happening in our communities. There are young men today that cannot work outside their community. They cannot work outside their community because if they are seen by somebody else, someplace else, all hell breaks loose. It doesn't only endanger them, but it endangers the life of the others around them that they're working with, that they're socializing with, that are just in the presence of the vicinity. This is not to be taken lightly. So we cannot allow our young men who have no resources at all, never worked a day in their life, to be handed a firearm and then given a project which is to murder somebody, and do not have anything in place that if we have sufficient evidence to see who is behind the crime, that we cannot at least inquire into that evidence. So, sir, as I said, it is a conversation that allows us to look broadly at the issues not only surrounding bail, but addressing the crime situation and those behind the crime as well. So we have called on the anti-gang legislation for a conversation. We have called on a conversation for the gun court. We have called for conversation on degrees of homicide that empowers the police then to make the appropriate charges and then allows the court to either grant bail or not grant bail, and where there's no granting of bail, we expedite those cases. All in an effort to make sure that persons who are charged present themselves to a court and a jury in the shortest possible time, so that that determination of guilt or not, or innocence, will happen in short order. Not that a crime is committed and the next month we see the person that has been charged, after being plastered in the front page of the paper, having all the headlines, back in our communities for 4 and 5 years, not having faced the ruling. So as I said, Mr. President, it is really, my job here was just really to reinforce those particular things that the opposition has been calling for over the last 3 weeks. Resources to support the judicial system, not only in the courts itself, but those that feed into the courts, the probation department, the welfare department, the child care, the police service, and the office of the public prosecution as well. Make sure that we are proactive in making sure that those are manned and that we have the human resource capacity to support the expedition of cases so that the backlog is reduced and so that new cases do not have then to wait 36 months and beyond, and then persons are on bail. We also said, sir, it is important that we look at the gun court, and the data supports this suggestion. 284 outstanding cases related to firearms. A specialized court, take 1 or 2 of these courts, specialize them and run those cases through them so that we get some justice and so that we get to these perpetrators. We also talked again, sir, about the degree of homicides, again to expedite the court hearings. In other words, the police makes a decision based on its evidence. The court makes a judgment on whether the legislation is clear on whether the person can have an option for bail or not. For those that cannot have bail, again, we have this human resource capacity that supports the judicial system and that we can get those cases heard in a timely manner, so then those persons are not infringed by their constitutional right to freedom and they have to come on bail without having to face the court. And finally, sir, we also introduced the notion of the anti-gang legislation discussion, because very often the question is asked, so you just have to go on social media, how old is this kid? How old is he? Still got his mother futures, young men primarily, targeted to commit crime. When persons behind the crime run freely. And they cherry pick, today is one person, tomorrow is the other person. And then in the pipeline, there are 14-year-olds coming out in the next 5 years that will become 19 and 18 and finish school, looking up to some of these persons. And we are not here to cast judgment. We are here to say that if there is enough evidence, to support that persons are behind the scenes calling the shots, that there should be a facility that we can bring a legitimate case or questioning towards these persons or against these persons. So, sir, those are my few points as relates to my contribution to the debate. I look forward to hearing some of the attorneys' presentation as relates to the details of the Bail Act as we continue the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Walters. Are there any more speakers? If not, any other speakers? Senator Watson.
I will then rise, sir. I was on part 4.
Senator Kevin Boyce.
I will rise, sir. Thank you for acknowledging me. I was on part 4 of what I was proposing to say, as we seem to be breaking from all norms and doing which is good. Anyway, sir, we are here again in the debate on the Bail Act. Well, I shouldn't say we, the collective noun, to include you, Mr. President, because you were not here the last time. But we as a Senate were here, gathered in 2020 or 2019, I can't recall. The faces on the government side, there are only 2 from that side who are here still. There's been a complete revamp, even though the government itself remains unchanged, unchallenged. On the independent side, I think we're pretty much the same, although we have been joined in our ranks by persons who were not independent previously. And we now have a full and robust opposition, continuing the fine precedent of the Westminster system. Why I say deja vu, sir, is that when we had the debate in 2020, the sentiments which were expressed by the government at the time, from my recollection, mirror the sentiments that are being expressed today. An unacceptable amount of murders and an acceptable amount of guns being used in the commission of these acts. The argument that is being put forward with regard to stability, good governance, serious crime, were also put forward by the then leader of government business. I think everyone agreed that when we last had the debate, there was a common understanding that the government was seeking to do something about the crime situation. And the government got the support in seeking to do something about the crime situation. And in granting that support, I believe it was expressed by more than one speaker that there would be a challenge to the legislation taken to the courts. So said, so done, and the decision of Lamar Jones versus the AG dealt with the court's perspective of the bill from 2020. And I think it's important to have a discussion about that decision, not in the context of a law lecture, but in the context of assisting the government, who I assume will be speaking more later on, as to the why the bill that we are seeing today has to be brought and has to be passed. Because these issues were raised by the court and identified as issues which, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, should have been articulated in a fuller manner. So in the case of Lamar Jones versus AG, the court said the bill from 2020 was unconstitutional. And why the bill was unconstitutional, the court said, was that the right to bail is a fundamental right under the Constitution. Apparently it ranks just under life with regard to how important it is. And the presumption of innocence, all the terms that we usually hear, a fair trial, and a trial within a reasonable time. Now, Mr. President, you will never hear me assert expertise in anything. And you've heard my comments about experts already. What I can say is a certain amount of time spent learning very hard lessons, which I then try to pass on the benefit of my experience. And why I say that's relevant, sir, is that in looking at the decision from the court, the overall statement from the judge was that the legislation was disproportionate. The legislation was found to be disproportionate in the context because while you have the ability to erode a constitutional right or impact a constitutional right, it has to be proportionate. And I'll come back to that as to what that means. The other issue with the legislation was that it offended against the separation of powers. That is, Parliament was seen to be encroaching on the ambit of a judge. And how was Parliament seen to be doing that? By, it was saying, 24 months restriction before bail can be sought. The court went on to state that it was a breach of the constitutional right to liberty and protection of law, and some other technical arguments with regard to how the amendment was done and whether it was sufficient to deal with the constitutionality and the amendment to that right. But the takeaway is this: the court accepted and gave a litany of Caribbean jurisprudence in which Caribbean governments have said, we have a problem, we are going to pass legislation to deal with the problem, and then the judiciary comes along and say, well, I understand what you're doing, however, this is a bridge too far. That is what happened in 2020. If anyone goes and looks at the decision, her ladyship who gave the decision sets out in detail the literal history of Caribbean jurisprudence. And I mean, not use fancy word. Caribbean law courts saying, hey, Parliament, we understand we have gun crimes. They spoke about Belize. They spoke about Jamaica. They spoke about Trinidad. But you cannot pass this type of law because it impacts your citizens' rights. And of course, when we have the conversation about rights, it's not just the rights of the criminals that we like to assert, but it's rights which impact us all. So the court said, we understand. However, you can't go that far. That's the long and short of what happened in 2020 in terms of the decision, sir, of Lamar Jones versus AG. Now, the new bill that we're dealing with is certainly, at first blush, less heavy-handed. So the previous bill from 2020 said, no bail for certain offenses until a 24-month period has expired. What this new bill does is says you have a right to bail. So it reconfirms the right which is set out in the Constitution. It says that while you have this right, in considering if you are getting bail when you have done certain crimes, first of all, you have to seek it, which is the norm. You're supposed to be held until it is determined. And then there are factors which are given to ascertain if the bail is to be granted. So one of the issues the court found previously in the 2020 bill was that you had taken away the discretion. What this bill seeks to do now in 2024 is to say, well, hey, these are the factors which you should consider in granting bail, and it nicely saves the discretion of the court by saying any other factors the court wishes to consider can go into making that decision. A point which wasn't readily picked up in the debate of the previous bill is also that this bill contemplates the Chief Justice is now the one who makes the determination as to whether bail should be granted, or assigns a judge to make that decision. What jumps out at me is the almost imperceptible shifting of the burden, but that's not a conversation for the legislature. That's a conversation for the courts. Sir, I spoke about hard-earned experience. And I think one of the lessons I have learned while serving this nation, combining it with legal stuff, is that you understand the distinction between making laws to govern and the interpretation of those laws. Two different things. The government is tasked with the responsibility, and I say government in the sense of its definition as in Parliament, is tasked with the responsibility to protect the nation and all its citizens. In seeking to do so, the government is entitled to set out what it thinks is the best form of legislative mechanism to do so. We then have the checks and balances in terms of the judiciary, which says, well, hey, government, that's your concept and that's a good idea, but you're not allowed to do that. And that's how it works. That's how it should work. So the debate that we have in the context is recognizing what happened in 2020, recognizing why it happened in 2020, but coming out of that exercise, what lessons have been learned from 2020 to 2024. I can see, sir, that lessons have been learned in terms of the legislation because it is different. We were told by the government's representative of its bases in the South African courts, which we also follow for other matters like judicial management, so we shouldn't be wary of it. And the concept of bail being restricted in circumstances is accepted by courts. But what the courts say is that if you are seeking to restrain the bail, you have to come with cogent evidence. And what I have noticed lacking from the debate, and maybe because I'm speaking so early, it hasn't been presented at yet, is that the same anecdotal references that were being stated in 2020 are being stated now. Campus Trends was how many years ago, sir? What the court said in Lamar Joseph was that you needed to provide evidence as to the why the legislation was needed, not just in terms of numbers of murders, but the amount of murders which were done by persons who were on bail. Why it's important in the interest of national security for the legislation to be passed. The detailed evidence as to the investigation and the police resources deployed and why this is necessary to support the fight. If we repeat and recycle the same arguments that were made in 2020, we run the risk of the court saying, have you shown, besides the nature of the bill, the evidence as to why it is necessary? So I am assuming that will be coming forth subsequently. We're all here to a man can say we are against violent crime, we're against murder, do something about it, is wrong. We are with you, the nation is with you. But the concept that it is enough to get up and repeat the argument without learning the hard-earned lessons, I think will do a disservice to the objectives of the government. And as usual, Mr. President, you know I make these suggestions from a certain place. The data, sir, which the court calls for is that, and is set out in the decision of Lamar Joseph, evidence as to why it is necessary. Now, what I have been able to find, and I have to cite my source, sir, Caribbean Signal, and they've asked that we cite Amit Utpanchali in relation to the quantum. I'm just looking at quantum of murders. I'm not looking, I don't have the data as to how many were done by persons on bail. But what we see, sir, in 2017 in Barbados, there were 30. In 2018, there were 28. In 2019, there were 49. 2020, Bail Act passed. There were 41. Now, anecdotally, we can say 2021, there were 32. 2022, 17. 2023, 19. 2023, Bail Act struck down. 2024, new act. We now are at 26 murders in the month of July. Is it a causation or a correlation that bail acts mean reduction? This is the type of discourse and information I believe the public wants. Because the public is hearing not only the government side, the public is going to hear that this is a restriction on fundamental human rights, and this is being done as part of an attempt, and it's all the stuff which you hear on social media. The opposition is doing its job in terms of raising the issues, and it's politicking, saying, hey, we should be given credit for it. The government is saying you shouldn't be given credit for it because you're being vainglorious, and we're the ones who take care of the public and they vote for us twice, and they want to hear from you, and we are doing what is necessary to protect the nation. But at some point, you have to present yourself to a higher authority and get real with the information as to the cause. Why is it necessary to pass the act? It's not just about the murders. Certainly, if it can help, you will get the support. But what is it about the murders and the persons on bail and the commission of the offenses in relation to firearms? I believe that needs to be dwelled into more today, sir. And I'm assuming it will be. A frank conversation needs to be had. We need to move away, sir, from who did what and whose fault it is. And I know that's hard to tell politicians. No politician has ever advanced by saying, hey, good job. Things are all right. But at some point, we got to put this country first and do what is necessary to protect the citizens. So let's learn from the lessons of Lamar Jones versus the AG, and let's have a debate, because the courts, when they're construing this legislation, looks at what is said. They go to Hansard to say, I am having a difficulty finding the intention of Parliament. Let me hear what the parliamentarians have said. So let's rise to the occasion and have a debate which provides not only the courts with the information they need, but also the nation as to why it's being done, why we believe it is necessary, and why we think it's in the interest of the people of Barbados. That's my contribution, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Kevin Boyce. Senator Anvili Boyce.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Thank you for recognizing me. Sir, we come here today, I think, in pursuit of, or in furtherance of that well-known constitutional mandate that compels all of us who have the privilege of sitting in these places to make laws, to contribute to the making of laws for the peace, order, and good government of this country. I think undoubtedly that constitutional edict has never been as real as it is today, certainly for someone relatively new to these places. Sir, we are here today in pursuit of public safety. We are here today, sir, because there is growing concern in the country about violent crime, about the confluence between violent crime and the use of firearms. We are here today, sir, to provide legislative response, legislative succor, I suppose, to a country that is concerned, that is unnerved by what, if we allow it to go any further, in my view, can be the undoing of the society that we know and that we love. This, sir, in my view, is not a moment for grandstanding, thank you to the Honourable Senator. It is a moment where this Parliament and this chamber has the opportunity to give as cogent an example of what we can achieve in a representative democracy when we heed the call of those who wish to live and work and to frolic about this country safely. And perhaps I should say, I make the distinction about a representative democracy and about the extent to which the average Barbadian wishes safety. I think it is safe to say that all of us in this chamber, irrespective of our allegiances and our compulsions, that we too want a safe Barbados. And that is the reason we are here today, Mr. President. Sir, the problem of gun violence and the problem of the popularity of firearms, sir, has the ability to gash at the very social fabric of this country. And none of us should convince ourselves that we would be sufficiently protected from the effects of such occurrences, Mr. President. And this government, hearing the voices of the electorate, hearing the voices of average Barbadians, all have decided that that which we debate today is in part an appropriate solution. I say in part an appropriate solution, sir, because make no mistake, the response required to, as best we can, rid this country of violent crime, as best we can, wrestle the issues of recidivism and violent recidivism to the ground, are not only legislative in nature. They require the contribution of several sections of Barbadian society. So complex is the problem, Mr. President, that I don't think that any single Barbadian can suggest or again comfort themselves with the notion that it is somebody else's work and somebody else's business. It is all of our work and all of our business, Mr. President. And so the government, I should say that in my view, that which we consider today should not be considered in isolation from the broader work of the government to keep this country safe. You've heard some recitation of those particulars in preceding speeches, sir. But here we are today, recognizing that the work is not complete until we can achieve not some esoteric and academic concept of public safety, but that we achieve a notion of public safety, sir, where we do not worry about how late we traverse the streets. We do not wake up on mornings and hold our breath about that which happened the night before. And so, sir, there is this legislative response to attempting to, as best we can, and as best we can, cauterize the issues of violent crime and cauterize the issues more particularly of recidivism. Mr. President, at Section 6 of the bill, sir, let me begin by saying that bill is sometimes considered a rather rudimentary exercise. Any first-year advocacy student of any of the Caribbean law schools will tell you the nature of a bill application, and they can probably recite the particulars for you of an application of a man. You know, he is not known to the law, and he is employed and is the breadwinner for his family, and he's remorseful, and he intends to go to Wednesday night prayer service with his mother from here on out, sir. This bill, though, the bill we contemplate today requires that we take a fresh look and a fresh guard on this question of bail. I was going to section 6 before, sir, and section 6 lays out the circumstances in which bail may be refused. And it lists, let me bring it a little closer because I don't see very well, old age, a number of factors or circumstances, more appropriately, in which bail may be refused, sir. And in section 6(1)(d), sir, it says, where there is a likelihood of the defendant, if granted bail, will undermine or jeopardize the objectives or the proper functioning of the criminal justice system, including the bail system. And I'll go on to read E, which also says that where in exceptional circumstances, there's a likelihood that the release of the defendant will not be in the interest of public order, public safety, or public security. Sir, and the bill goes on to offer an expansive elucidation on what those particular things mean. But I want to underscore, sir, that at the very core of this bill is the notion of public order, public safety, and public security. That is the thing that through the contemplation and hopefully the passage of this bill, sir, we hope to achieve. And the bill goes on to elucidate, sir, what those particular things mean. It says, in considering whether the ground in subsection D has been established, the court may, where applicable, take into account a number of factors, including the fact that the defendant, knowing it to be false, supplied information at the time of arrest, false information that is, at the time of arrest or during the bail proceedings, or whether the defendant is in custody on another charge. Or any previous failure on the part of the defendant to comply with bail conditions, or any indication that the defendant will not comply with bail conditions. Sir, the section proposes to ensure the very integrity of our criminal justice system, the very integrity of the bail system, sir. Because again, we, as you have heard this morning, we are beating back the trend of recidivism. We are beating back the trend of people asserting their constitutional rights to liberty, to ultimately commit further crime, sir. And it is a circumstance that this country cannot tolerate. The expansive elucidations of section 6, sir, I think ultimately aid the court in their deliberations on whether an accused person should get bail or not. Again, it is not the rudimentary exercise that it once was and that every student of a Caribbean law school can recite for you. Sir, the government provides that expansive elucidation, particularly, and the provision at 610, sir, because it recognizes that it must balance, along with its responsibility to ensure public safety, that it must balance the rights of the accused, Mr. President. That it must, so that the very formulation of 610 that calls for exceptional, that says that unless in exceptional circumstances, sir, that the defendant can, unless in exceptional circumstances where the defendant can prove that he ought to be granted bail, sir, that provision is indicative of a government attempting to balance its various roles and responsibilities, the rights of an accused person and the rights and the obligation to the broader society, Mr. President, to ensure public safety. Mr. President, the bill before the chamber presents for all of us in here, but ultimately for the Barbadian society, I think, a moment of conscience. It presents that moment because I think with the contemplation and the promulgation of this and conversation around this legislation, we must recognize how serious an issue we are trying to beat back, Mr. President. You know, I made some reference to the representative democracy that we practice in this country. And it is a kind of representative democracy, sir, that will require us from time to time as people who occupy these spaces to listen to the electorate, to listen to the population more appropriately, and to do the best that we can in their interest. I think that moment is undoubtedly now. I think this is one of those moments. It is a moment, I think, that the Barbadian public wishes to see us rise, as we are invited to by the preceding speaker, the Honourable Senator Boyce. And to perhaps put our compulsions aside, Mr. President, in the interest of this country and in the interest of public safety. Because what do we risk if we do not? What do we risk if we wait? What do we risk if we twiddle our thumbs, Mr. President, and hope for better times ahead in the absence of concerted action to achieve those better realities? We risk, Mr. President, losing, like some have indicated this morning, a generation of young men who I want to believe, and I think that in the spirit of this debate, we all must believe that it is our solemn duty to keep them safe, that it is our solemn duty as well to ensure that justice is served where justice is appropriate, Mr. President. This is not a moment, in my view, for the I don't know if that's parliamentary language. It is not, in my view, Mr. President, a moment for us to do anything other than to remember that constitutional mandate to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Barbados. So this is a moment where I think each of us who sits in this room should remember the oath we took on that, for me, on that very warm January morning. Perhaps it is that we do not come to these places for our service is not tested for the easy days. Our service is tested, Mr. President, for days like this, when our country begs us to act, and when the survival, the continuity, the stability of this very country depends on decisive and concrete action. Sir, if we do anything else today, we risk losing this country, we risk losing a generation of young men who, like I said, I believe can be saved. We risk, Mr. President, not making good on the promise of this country. We risk not living up to that oath that we took at our various times. Mr. President, I think it is safe to say that we would rather not be here today, and by that I mean that We would rather not be confronted with a problem that requires this kind of action. I think without fail, Mr. President, our service notwithstanding, we can all think about one or two other things that also deserve our attention today. But here we are, because our country needs us in this moment, and to do anything else is to not live up to the promise and the project of Barbados, which I think is to continually improve and to make better the lives of Barbadians. And given what we are debating, Mr. President, we can only make better a life that exists, and the very threat of the loss of life, the very notion of the possibility of the loss of life as a result of things that we can do something about, we can try to do something about. Sir, and do something about, we must. Mr. President, I encourage all of us today to live up to the promise and to the oath that we took when we were invited to sit in this place. We owe it in the interest of public safety. We owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to this country. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Andre Boyce. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the suspension of this sitting of the House for lunch for 1 hour to resume at 2:30 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:30 p.m. today. Will those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. This sitting is suspended until 2:30 p.m. today.